It began with a lie, or at least that's what many would later call it. On a cold February morning in 2003, millions of people across the world watched as a man stood before the United Nations, holding up a small vial. He claimed it represented a deadly substance, something that could kill thousands in moments. The message was clear, urgent, and terrifying. A nation in the Middle East possessed weapons so dangerous that waiting was no longer an option. Within weeks, the world would be at war. But what if the truth behind that moment was far more complicated and far more troubling? This is the real story of the Iraq War, a war that reshaped the world, changed millions of lives, and left behind questions that still haunt us today. To understand how it all began, we need to go back in time, before the bombs, before the invasion, and before the speeches that would justify it all. The story begins with a man, Saddam Hussein. For decades, Saddam ruled Iraq with an iron grip. Rising to power in 1979, he established a regime known for its brutality, strict control, and ruthless suppression of dissent. Under his leadership, Iraq became both feared and isolated. In the 1980s, Iraq fought a devastating war against neighboring Iran, a conflict that lasted 8 years and claimed over 1 million lives. During that time, Saddam's regime used chemical weapons, something that would later become a critical point in the global narrative against him. Then came 1990. In a sudden and shocking move, Saddam ordered the invasion of Kuwait, a small but oil-rich neighboring country. The world reacted immediately. A coalition led by the United States launched a military operation known as the Gulf War. Within weeks, Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait. But Saddam remained in power. After the war, Iraq faced strict sanctions. These were economic restrictions designed to weaken Saddam's regime and force compliance with international demands, including the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, often referred to as WMDs. For years, inspectors from the United Nations searched Iraq for these weapons. Sometimes they found evidence of past programs. Sometimes they were blocked or delayed. The situation remained tense, uncertain, and unresolved. Then came the turning point. September 11th, 2001. The September 11th attacks changed everything. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in coordinated terrorist attacks on American soil. The shock, fear, and anger that followed reshaped U.S. foreign policy overnight. The government, led by George W. Bush, declared a global war on terror. The immediate target was Afghanistan, where the group responsible, Al-Qaeda, was based. But soon, attention turned toward Iraq. The question was, why? Officials in the Bush administration began raising concerns about Saddam Hussein once again. They argued that Iraq still possessed weapons of mass destruction. They suggested that Saddam could potentially provide these weapons to terrorist groups. In speeches, interviews, and international forums, the message was repeated. The threat was real, and it was urgent. One of the most influential voices in this campaign was Colin Powell. His presentation at the United Nations in 2003, where he displayed that now famous vial, was meant to convince the world that action was necessary. Many believed him, but not everyone. Around the globe, protests erupted. Millions of people marched in cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, warning against war. They questioned the evidence, the timing, and the consequences. Still, the decision had already been made. On March 20th, 2003, the invasion began. The opening phase was called shock and awe. Missiles lit up the skies over Baghdad. Explosions echoed through the city. The goal was clear: overwhelm Iraqi forces quickly and decisively. Within weeks, coalition troops advanced rapidly. Iraqi defenses collapsed faster than many had expected. And then, on April 9th, 2003, a symbolic moment unfolded. In the heart of Baghdad, a statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down. Cameras captured the scene as people celebrated, climbed the statue, and cheered. To many watching around the world, it seemed like the end of a dictatorship. But in reality, it was only the beginning of something far more complex and far more dangerous. With Saddam's regime gone, the United States faced a new challenge: rebuilding Iraq. But this was not a simple task. The Iraqi government had been dismantled almost overnight. Key institutions were disbanded. The army was dissolved. Thousands of armed men were suddenly unemployed, angry, and uncertain about their future. In the absence of order, chaos began to spread. Looting broke out across cities. Infrastructure collapsed. Electricity, water, and basic services became unreliable. And then came the insurgency. Groups began attacking coalition forces using roadside bombs, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics. The conflict shifted from a conventional war to a prolonged and unpredictable struggle. American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that was often invisible. Civilians were caught in the middle. Among the most controversial aspects of the war were the prisons, particularly Abu Ghraib. In 2004, images emerged showing abuse of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. personnel. The photos shocked the world and sparked outrage. They raised serious questions about human rights, accountability, and the conduct of the war. At the same time, sectarian tensions were rising within Iraq itself. The country is home to different religious and ethnic groups, primarily Sunni and Shia Muslims. Under Saddam, power was largely concentrated in Sunni hands. After his fall, the balance shifted. Violence between these groups escalated. Bombings, assassinations, and reprisals became increasingly common. Iraq was not just facing an insurgency, it was on the brink of civil war. Meanwhile, one critical question remained unanswered. Where were the weapons of mass destruction? As months passed, no stockpiles were found. Investigations continued, reports were written, and eventually the conclusion became clear. Iraq did not have active WMD programs at the time of the invasion. This revelation changed everything. Public opinion began to shift. Critics argued that the war had been based on flawed intelligence, or worse, deliberate misinformation. Trust in leadership declined. The war, which had started with a sense of urgency and purpose, was now facing deep skepticism. Despite the challenges, the United States continued its efforts in Iraq. In 2007, a new strategy was introduced known as the Surge. Additional troops were deployed in an attempt to stabilize the country and reduce violence. For a time, it appeared to work. Attacks decreased. Some areas became more secure. Political processes began to take shape. But the underlying issues remained. In 2011, nearly 8 years after the invasion, U.S. combat troops officially withdrew from Iraq. The war, however, was far from over. In the years that followed, a new threat emerged: ISIS. Taking advantage of instability in both Iraq and neighboring Syria, this extremist group seized large territories and declared a so-called caliphate. Once again, Iraq became a battlefield. Once again, international forces returned. Today, the legacy of the Iraq War is still unfolding. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. Millions were displaced. Entire cities were destroyed and rebuilt. For the United States, the war cost trillions of dollars and left lasting impacts on its military and foreign policy. For Iraq, the consequences have been even more profound. A nation that once stood as a regional power was transformed politically, socially, and economically. And for the world, the war raised critical questions. How do we determine truth in times of fear? How do we balance security with responsibility? And what happens when decisions made in moments of urgency echo across decades? That small vial held up in 2003 may have seemed insignificant at the time, but it became a symbol of how information, belief, and power can shape history. The Iraq War was not just a conflict between nations. It was a turning point, a story of decisions, consequences, and the complex reality of modern warfare. And even today, as we look back, one thing remains certain: the full truth of that war is still being uncovered, and its impact is still being felt.